"It's just a flag, Mr. Grayson. Take it down or we'll escalate." That's what she said. Carla Benwick, head of the HOA, queen of clipped hedges and pastel blouses. She stood at the end of my walkway like she owned the air around her, pointing to the old flag my grandfather used to raise every morning at sunrise, faded at the edges, a little threadbare, but real. I looked at that flag, then back at her. "You want me to take down the one thing in this house that still smells like my grandfather's hands?" I'm Daniel Grayson, carpenter by trade, stubborn by blood. This old place, it's not just where I live, it's where I came back to after he passed. And if you've ever had to fight for a memory, welcome. Before we dive in, I'd love to know where you're watching this from. Drop your location in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more stories where justice doesn't knock, it kicks the damn door in. My grandfather built this house with his bare hands after he got back from Korea. It's not much by today's standards. Single story, creaky porch, one window that whistles when it storms. But to me, it's a cathedral. He used to raise the flag every morning like clockwork, right after feeding the stray cat who never left. The flagpole's old iron, rusted. He welded it himself from a salvaged fence post. I never asked why he kept using that same flag, creased from 1,000 foldings. But I know now, it wasn't about politics. It was about him, about holding on to something constant. When he passed, I didn't want to sell the house like everyone suggested. I moved back instead, changed careers, left the city. I wanted peace. I got Carla Benwick. She rang my doorbell 2 days after I moved in, walking like she was avoiding stepping on the dirt. Clipboard, badge, disapproval, the whole HOA starter pack. "This flag wasn't approved by the compliance committee," she said. I thought she was joking. "It's a flag that's not an eyesore." She didn't even blink. "We allow seasonal decor, Daniel. Flags must be within approved guidelines. Yours is too worn. Also, it's on a non-compliant pole." "Yeah," I said, "because he built it before this neighborhood even had a board to whine about poles." Carla didn't like that. She frowned and scribbled something on her form like I'd just spat on her lawn flamingos. The next day, I found a citation on my door. $50. Reason, unauthorized display. I thought about paying it, just to keep the peace. But then I opened the side shed to get my tools and found my grandfather's fishing chair, the one he used to sit in every weekend, facing the lake behind the property. That chair hasn't moved in years, yet the paint on the armrest still bears the sweat outline of his grip. I sat in it, just for a minute. The air smelled like pine and charcoal, that same smell from when I was 10, sitting beside him while he mended rods and told stories I didn't yet understand. He used to say, "The flag's not the point, Danny, it's the principle. If they ask you to give up something honest, they won't stop there." He was right. The next HOA meeting, I showed up in boots and a flannel, out of place among the khakis and lemon water. Carla didn't acknowledge me, but I could feel the tension ripple when I sat down. They were talking about lawn regulations and pool hours, real earth-shattering stuff, when Carla slid in an item under new business. "Non-compliant symbolic displays," she said, "will be issuing removal notices for properties not meeting standards." Someone raised a hand. What exactly counts as symbolic? Carla didn't answer directly, she just looked at me, then smiled. I left early, but not before I caught a glimpse of Judith Vale, the HOA treasurer, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered papers. She didn't look at me, didn't have to. Her silence was loud. I drove home in the dark and parked by the old tree stump where my grandfather carved a bench years ago. It still faces the lake, crooked but sturdy. That night I sat there until the moon rose over the water, the flag behind me fluttering in the breeze. They want compliance? They can try, because that flag isn't coming down. Not now, not ever. The night after the HOA meeting, I stayed out on the bench until my back ached. I could hear bullfrogs down by the water, soft wind brushing the trees behind me, and that flag, still up, still defiant, whipping gently against the sky. By morning, there was another envelope taped to my door. Violation, improper front garden ornamentation. Fine, $35.00. Attached was a grainy photo of the little gnome that had been tucked under the hydrangea bush since my grandfather planted them. The gnome was missing half an ear. My grandmother used to call it Sarge and swore it brought good luck during fishing season. So now, apparently, Sarge was a threat to community harmony. I laughed, then I noticed the second citation beneath it. Violation: mailbox design exceeds regulation dimensions. Fine, $45.00. That mailbox? Handmade from cedar with our family name burned into the side. My grandfather built it after the original was knocked over in a storm. Everyone on the street used to compliment it. Now, it was a problem. That's when I stopped laughing. I walked over to Tommy Heller's place around noon. He was out front, elbows deep in a lawnmower engine. The guy's hands always looked like they'd just fought with steel. Good guy, maybe 50s, with a grease-streaked ball cap and a voice like gravel in a tin can. "Tommy," I called, holding up the citations, "you ever get fined for a gnome?" He wiped his hands on his shirt, glanced at the paper, and snorted. "Carla's at it again, huh? She tried to write me up last year for painting my shutters non-compliant green." He leaned in and added, "They were the exact same color as the year before." "You fight it?" "Knock," he said, standing up with a grimace. "You can't win with people who rewrite the rules mid-game. They don't want compliance, they want control." We sat in his garage for a while, him sipping beer, me quietly stewing. "You know," Tommy said, "your granddad, he was the last person who scared Carla. Man had a spine." I nodded. "Yeah, he taught me how to fish, how to weld, how to tell someone no without raising your voice." Tommy grinned. That's why she hated him. That evening I decided to walk the edge of the property. It's a habit I picked up as a kid. Back then we used to walk the perimeter of the backyard, all the way down to the lake, just to make sure everything was still ours. It felt different now, like I was being watched. Halfway down the slope near the rusted birdhouse, I spotted something new, a metal stake in the dirt painted orange. HOA property survey markers. I followed them. 4 more, each one poking out of the ground like a warning. They were cutting across my backyard, from the corner of my fence all the way down to the lake. I knelt beside one and flicked the dirt off the top, freshly placed. Still smelled like factory paint. Someone had quietly redrawn the lines, and they didn't even bother telling me. The next HOA bulletin came the following morning, slipped inside my mailbox like a snake in a shoebox. Effective immediately, backyard fences encroaching on HO-managed green zones must be removed. I reread it twice. Then, once more, encroaching wasn't even the right word. My grandfather built that fence before this development even had street lights. So I did what he would have done. I pulled out the family filing box. It's this old blue thing with a broken clasp and a weird smell, somewhere between dust and WD-40. Inside were tax records, mechanic receipts, even his fishing license from 1983, laminated with Scotch tape. And there it was, an original plat map, drawn by hand, faded ink, my grandfather's signature scrawled at the bottom. And the property lines? They didn't match the HOA's version, not even close. I made 3 copies. One went in a lockbox, one stayed with me. The third I taped to the inside of my shed, just in case they tried something bigger. That night, I sat on the dock in the dark, legs dangling over the water. A bat swooped low over the lake. I could hear the faint hum of porch lights flickering across the water. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. They could come after my gnome, my mailbox, my fence. But the more they pushed, the more I realized they were scared, not of me, but of the history tied to this place, of what my grandfather built, of what they couldn't buy or bully out of existence. I looked back at the flag. It still waved, still whispered, "Hold your ground." And I intended to do exactly that. The next morning I woke to the sound of voices just beyond the fence line. Not loud, not angry, just organized. Clipboard tones, measuring wheels clicking. Someone laughed. I stepped outside, coffee still in hand, and spotted 2 HOA board members pacing along the stakes they'd planted. One was a guy I'd never seen before, wireframe glasses, tucked-in polo. The other? Judith Vale. She wasn't talking, just watching. She stood stiff, arms crossed, eyes locked on the grass like it might rise up and bite her. And when she noticed me watching from the porch, her entire frame went still. I raised my mug in a half salute. She blinked, then looked away. I didn't know much about Judith, only that she was the treasure and lived at the far end of the street in a cream-colored house that hadn't changed since the ADS. Never saw her out much, never heard her speak during meetings, but there was one thing I did remember, something from years back, long before I ever imagined moving back here. When I was about 14, my grandfather took me out fishing after school. I remember the water was glass that day, the sun a little too bright, and him unusually quiet. He pointed toward the opposite shore and said, "Judith used to come out here with her husband, right there by the cove, good people, until the rules got to them." I never understood what he meant, but that image, Judith with a tackle box and a soft smile, sitting on a folded chair, didn't match the ghost I saw this morning. Later that afternoon, I walked to the HOA office, which was really just the old community library repurposed into a Dropbox and bulletin board operation. Nothing but a dusty desk, a rotating fan, and the strong smell of lemon cleaner. I knocked on the open door. Judith looked up from behind the desk. She was alone. "Daniel," she said, not quite surprised. "Something wrong?" I stepped in, careful not to cross the faded welcome mat. "Just came to see if there was a copy of the community zoning file I could look at, for educational purposes." She hesitated. Her hand hovered over a drawer. "That's not something we usually—" "I found the plat map," I said. "The original, my grandfather's, and the markers don't line up." Her hand dropped. "I see." A long pause. The fan ticked in the corner. "Judith," I said, softening my voice, "you knew my grandfather. You fished with him." She didn't answer, just stared past me like I'd spoken in a language she hadn't heard in years. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "Carla's been pushing for a rezoning for over a year," she whispered. "She said it was just a clerical thing, a cleanup, no one would notice." "But you did." Her lips trembled. She looked down at her hands, nodded, pale, shaking just slightly. "We voted on it late last winter. Only 5 of us. It passed, but I didn't ask enough questions. I didn't want to cause trouble." "And now?" Judith stood up slowly, walked to the filing cabinet. She opened it halfway, pulled a folder, then hesitated. "I can't give you this," she said, "not officially, but if someone were to photograph it while I step outside for fresh air—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. 10 minutes later, I stood under a pine tree in the side lot, phone buzzing in my pocket with 20 photos of the original rezoning request, none of which had been circulated publicly. No community vote, no posted notice. Just a handful of signatures and a date stamped during the holiday break, when no one was watching. This was a chessboard, and Carla had moved her pieces while the rest of us were still reading the rulebook. But now I had one of my own. That night, I walked back down to the lake, flashlight in hand. I passed the bench again, crooked, sturdy, same as always. Only this time, I didn't sit. I placed the original plat map on the wood, weighted it with a flat stone, and stood back. Because that bench had seen truth long before I ever returned, and now it would hold it again. I didn't know what Judith would do next, but I saw something in her face before I left that office. A flicker of the woman my grandfather once trusted. The silence wasn't just guilt. It was survival, and it was cracking. By the time I stepped back inside that night, I knew 2 things. 1, Judith Vale had just cracked open the first real fracture inside the HOA. 2, Carla Benwick wasn't going to let it slide. She didn't. The next morning, she was on my porch. No warning, no smile, just that hollow, tight-lipped stare that says, "I'm here because I have the power to be." She didn't even knock. I opened the door mid-step, coffee in hand, not in the mood for diplomacy. "Daniel," she said crisply, holding a manila folder against her chest like it contained sacred law. "We need to talk." Raised an eyebrow. Funny, I was just about to say the same. She stepped forward without waiting for an invitation, like she owned the wood under her shoes. "This has gone far enough," she snapped, flipping the folder open to reveal a form. "This is a formal notice of noncompliance. The flag, the gnome, the mailbox, and now the illegal fence line. That's 4 violations in a 30-day period. According to Section 9.4, that makes you eligible for a board-reviewed penalty, which includes fines, community service, or, if necessary, lien placement. I didn't respond right away. I just looked past her at the lake, still and glassy, and then back to her with a calm that felt less like patience and more like choosing which hill to dig a trench in. You want me to do community service because my grandfather left behind a flag and a fence. Carla's smile was professional, plastic. This isn't personal. Yes, it is, I said. It became personal when you started trying to erase him. She blinked, just for a second. Then she closed the folder and straightened up. Remove the flag within 5 business days. That's your final warning. Then she turned and walked off like a judge leaving the bench. I spent the rest of the day going through the house, his house, looking for anything else he might have left behind. Something bigger than a map, something official. I checked the study, the tool shed, even under the loose floorboard in the hallway where he used to stash old fishing magazines. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling there was more, somewhere. Around dusk, I sat on the bench again, not to think, just to feel. The wood under me still groaned the same way it did when I was a boy. The lake glittered beneath a lavender sky, wind tugging at the water like it wanted to take something from it. Then I remembered something from long ago. There was a storm once, when I was maybe 8. A big one. My grandfather ran out in the middle of it, cursing the wind because he'd forgotten to lock the shed. When he came back, soaked and muddy, he said something odd. That cabinet's got half the damn world in it. Storm's not stealing it. A cabinet. I'd never seen one in the shed. Not that I remembered. But maybe I hadn't looked hard enough. That night I called Erin, my sister. She picked up on the second ring. Hey, mountain man, she teased. How's the war with the lawn police? I need your legal brain, I said. I think I'm sitting on something big, but I'm not sure what to do with it. She listened as I laid it all out. Judith, the rezoning documents, the fines, the boundary stakes. When I finished, she was quiet for a beat. You're building a case, Danny, whether you meant to or not. Keep your head down, document everything, and do not take that flag down. Even if they push a lien? Let them try. If you've got proof they violated due process, they'll choke on it in court. I leaned back, looking up at the stars. Feels like I'm one letter away from being evicted by a rule book. Erin's voice softened. Then, maybe it's time you reminded them who wrote the land under that rule book. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I kept thinking about that cabinet, the one he bolted during the storm, and where I might find it. The next day, I was going to tear that shed apart until I did. Because if Carla wanted to play legal hardball, I was finally ready to swing back. By sunrise, I was already in the shed. The air was thick with that old wood and motor oil smell, the kind that seeps into your clothes and never quite leaves. I stood in the doorway for a second, letting my eyes adjust. Cobwebs draped from the rafters like brittle curtains. Dust motes spun in the narrow beams of sunlight slicing through the slats. If the cabinet was here, it wasn't obvious. I moved slowly, clearing boxes stacked with rusted bolts, tangled extension cords, and tackle boxes that hadn't seen water in years. A toolbox with a missing latch. A crate of license plates dating back to the 60s. I paused when I saw one from '82. Grandpa used to tell this story, how he got pulled over on the way to the lake because a cat crawled into the wheel well. The officer laughed so hard he let him go with a warning. I set it aside, smiling. Then I got back to it. Behind the far wall, covered in a shredded tarp and pressed between 2 sawhorses, I found it. A metal cabinet, gray, dent in the lower corner, combination lock. Bolted straight into the concrete. Bingo. The lock was old school, no fingerprint scanner or fancy tricks, just a rusted dial and a riddle. I knelt, wiped it down with my sleeve, and tried the obvious first. Birth years, street number, no luck. Then I remembered something from when I was a kid. Every time Grandpa left for a trip, fishing, flea market, didn't matter. He'd stop on the porch and say, 3 spins and faith, Danny, that's the key to everything. So I spun it 3 times to the right like he always mimed. Then I tried 1953, his enlistment year. The dial clicked. I turned the handle. I dropped it. The smell hit first. Old paper, tobacco, dry metal. Inside, stacked carefully, were rows of folders, 2 leather notebooks, and a velvet-lined box. I started with the notebooks. His handwriting was cramped but steady. Detailed notes, boundary lines, meeting minutes, names, dates, times. He had documented everything, and not just HOA nonsense. Founding bylaws, original land agreements, a personal journal detailing the negotiation he'd made decades ago with the landowners who eventually sold the community lake. It was never fully transferred to HOA jurisdiction, not officially. He retained partial ownership, and in his will, it passed to me. I sat there on the floor of the shed, back against the workbench, heart thudding like a drum in a rainstorm. The legal description alone was enough to rip the rug out from under the board. He knew this would happen, that someone would try to erase the old agreements, that control would shift hands and rules would tighten. So he'd written it all down? One line stood out in particular, scribbled in blue ink along the margin of a plat copy. Legacy is not a name on paper, it's who controls the water. I laughed under my breath. Because of course Grandpa would phrase it like that. I took everything I could carry and brought it into the house. Spread the papers across the kitchen table like a crime board, scanned copies onto a flash drive, took photos, sent one set to Erin just in case. She replied almost instantly, "Holy hell, this is gold, start preparing for war." I stared at the lake through the kitchen window, calm, deceptively calm. And for the first time in weeks, I wasn't angry, I was armed. That evening, I returned to the shed with a padlock and a fresh sense of purpose. As I locked the cabinet back up, I noticed something odd. Carved into the inside of the cabinet door, barely visible beneath layers of grime, was a single phrase: "You don't own what you fear." Grandpa never explained things straight. He believed people had to earn clarity. But standing there in that dim shed, I realized what he meant. The HOA, ruled by fear of fines, of rules, of consequences. They didn't own the lake. They just assumed no one would challenge them. Well, they were about to meet someone who would. I barely slept that night. Not because I was worried, but because I couldn't stop replaying my grandfather's words in my head. Legacy is who controls the water. He'd been preparing for this for years, not with rage or lawsuits, but with paperwork, patience, and a plan that spanned decades, the kind of long game most people don't even think to play. By mid-morning, I was back at the HOA office. Same dusty fan, same faded carpet, but this time I wasn't walking in as the guy with the gnome violation. I was walking in with leverage. Judith sat at the front desk, glasses perched low, the usual tremble in her hand as she signed something, but the moment she saw me, the pen froze. Her knuckles went pale. "Daniel," she said cautiously, glancing toward the back room, "now's not the best time. Carla's—" "I'm not here for Carla," I said. "I'm here for you." She blinked. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Did you find it?" I nodded. Her shoulders sagged like she'd been holding her breath for 5 years. "Come around back, quickly." She led me to a utility room lined with outdated filing cabinets and mismatched chairs. The blinds were half closed, casting jagged lines of shadow across the floor. She shut the door behind us, then faced me with a weight I hadn't seen on her before. "I didn't know your grandfather left anything behind," she said softly. "I thought, after he died, it would all be forgotten." Carla told the board the lake had been fully transferred. She waved a title packet around, said it was finalized in 2005. "Fake," I replied. "I've got the original, signed, notarized, and recorded, with his portion passing directly to me." Judith turned pale. "You? You could sue?" "Not yet," I said. "I'm giving them one chance to back off." She stared at me. Then, finally, she sat down. "I'm tired, Daniel. Tired of pretending I don't see what they do, the way Carla manipulates people. She hides behind policy like it's armor." I pulled out a copy of the deed and slid it across the table. "You were there when this neighborhood was just dirt and stakes. Tell me something. Why didn't you speak up when she started redrawing the lines?" She reached into her cardigan and pulled out a small locket. It clicked open with a soft snap. Inside, a photo. Her late husband standing on the old dock, arm around my grandfather. "Bailey both fought for this lake," she whispered. "When my husband passed, I lost more than a partner. I lost the part of me that challenged things." Carla stepped in fast. "Took control before I could find my footing again. And then it was too late." I let her words hang in the air. That kind of regret doesn't need commentary. After a moment, she looked at me, eyes glassy. "What are you going to do?" Something my grandfather never got the chance to do, I said. I'm going to put the truth on record. She hesitated, then opened a drawer and pulled out an old ledger. You'll want to see this. Inside were line item payments, entries that didn't match any budget Carla had ever presented at the public meetings, home improvement allocations, landscaping invoices for houses that didn't exist. Judith tapped one in particular. This money? It came from the Community Beautification Fund, but it went to her brother-in-law's company. Twice. Kickbacks, I said. Of course. She met my eyes. I'll testify, if it comes to that. Later that day, I walked back home, wind picking up just enough to make the flag snap once, sharp and clean. I passed the bench, our bench, and paused. I laid my hand on the wood, fingers brushing the grain, then reached into my pocket and placed the deed on the seat, weighted by a small river stone. A quiet offering, a symbol, the same way my grandfather left the map behind. This time, it wasn't just the bench that carried legacy. It was the truth. By nightfall, I'd built out a folder. PDFs, photos, audio recordings, Judith's ledger, the deed, and a timeline Aaron helped draft. It was clean, tight, lethal. Tomorrow, I'd start laying traps. But for now, I sat out back with my boots in the dirt and let the silence stretch. Not an uneasy silence. A ready one. By morning, my kitchen looked like a war room. Laptop open, documents spread in a perfect arc, highlighters bleeding over photocopies, and the deed to the lake dead center under a coffee mug. Aaron was on speaker, going through everything line by line. You've got enough to trigger a cease and desist, she said, voice calm but clipped. But before we hit them with the legal hammer, we need to make sure they swing first. What does that mean? I asked, flipping through the ledger Judith had given me. I think it means we bait them, Aaron replied. Make them confident, let them push harder, and when they do, then we hit. I sat back in the chair, staring out the window. The flag moved like it always did, subtle, certain, untouched. I thought of Grandpa's cabinet, the carved words inside. You don't own what you fear. Carla wasn't afraid of me. Not yet. She still thought she was winning. So we'd let her think that, for a little longer. That afternoon, I paid a visit to Walt Lendon, a retired land surveyor who used to fish with my grandfather every spring. His cabin sat just off the county road, tucked behind a curtain of dogwoods. Still smelled like cedar and pipe tobacco. He opened the door with a chuckle. Well, I'll be damned. Daniel Grayson. Got a minute? I asked. For you, always. Inside, I unrolled the map Grandpa had drawn, the same one from the cabinet, and showed him the current survey stakes the HOA had placed. He didn't even need time to compare. That's a scam, pure and simple. These lots were plotted before the HOA even existed. Your granddad kept copies of everything. I've got more, I said. Ledger books, payment trails, a witness. Walt whistled. You planning to burn them down or just humiliate them real slow? Both, I said, but legally. He tapped the deed with one thick finger. You know what this gives you? Leverage? Control, he said. They can't fine you for access, and if the HOA uses the lake in any way, you can make them pay for it. Back home, I added Walt's sworn statement to the file. Then I took a drive to the county recorder's office and filed a notice of partial ownership on the community lake parcel. Public record. Irrefutable. Afterward, I went straight to the dock with a small hammer and sign. Carbon monoxide only, permission required. Violators. Subject to trespass notice. I planted it right near the bench. Subtle enough to be overlooked by most, obvious enough for Carla to notice. And sure enough, she did. The next morning, I heard tires crunching over gravel. Carla stood at the edge of my property in a coral blazer and sunglasses, arms crossed. That sign is a violation of Visual Code 3.7. You can't post anything not approved by the board. Good morning, Carla, I said. Lovely day for due process. Her jaw twitched. You think this is funny? I think it's mine, I said, and I think you should ask Judith what else I've got. She didn't answer that. Instead, she leaned in, voice sharp. I don't care what your grandfather wrote on a napkin. You've got 5 days to take that sign down, or I'm pushing a board action to restrict your property access entirely. I nodded slowly. Then you'd better make it public. Because that's what I wanted. That night, Tommy showed up with 2 folding chairs and a 6-pack. We sat by the dock, watching the wind cut ripples across the lake. Are you really going to go through with this? He asked. I handed him a copy of the deed. I already did. He grinned. Your granddad would have loved this. I'm not doing it for love, I said. I'm doing it so no one else has to fight this battle again. Tommy raised his beer in a quiet toast. To Sarge, he said. I laughed. To Sarge. The old gnome still sat in the garden, paint peeling, helmet cracked, watching over it all like a tiny, battle-hardened sentry. Tomorrow, I'd attend the next HOA board meeting. Not as a target, as a landowner with a folder full of teeth, the kind they couldn't ignore. And finally, Carla wouldn't be the one setting the rules. The HOA board meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a bland little building with beige walls, uncomfortable chairs, and an overpowering scent of citrus cleaner, as if they were trying to scrub the truth out of the air itself. I arrived 5 minutes early, not to look polite, to be seen. Carla was already at the head of the table, her hair pinned in a perfect spiral, wearing a teal pantsuit that probably made her feel 10 feet tall. She was flanked by the usual suspects, her silent son Gavin, the nodding board member Phyllis, and Judith, who wouldn't meet my eyes. Good, I didn't want her to, yet, not until it mattered. The room was packed. Neighbors lined the walls. Tommy was there too, arms crossed, a faint smirk twitching at the corners of his mouth. Someone passed me a folded chair, and I set it near the back. Let's begin, Carla said sharply. We have several pressing matters. Chief among them, an unsanctioned sign placed on the shared lakefront property, which may constitute grounds for disciplinary action. She didn't even look at me when she said it. Instead, she clicked her pen and continued. This meeting is being recorded for accuracy. Perfect. She read off a prepared statement accusing me of vandalizing HOA property with unapproved signage. She cited Visual Code 3.7, trespassing bylaws, and even dared to mention public safety concerns related to unauthorized landmarkers. I let her finish, then stood. Chair recognizes Daniel Grayson, Judith mumbled, barely audible. Thank you, I said, and pulled the flash drive from my pocket. I've provided each board member with a digital folder containing deed records, notarized property rights, financial ledgers, and an affidavit from a certified land surveyor, all confirming my legal ownership of the lake parcel in question. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Carla blinked, just once. I walked to the front and laid a printed copy of the deed on the table. Carla stared at it like it was a loaded weapon. That sign, I said. It's not vandalism, it's jurisdiction. Phyllis reached for the document, eyes wide. Gavin leaned over, whispering something in Carla's ear. She didn't speak. Her throat moved, but her voice didn't follow. I also have copies of fund transfers, I added, showing misuse of HOA beautification money. Payments made to Carla's brother-in-law's landscaping company for projects that don't appear in any meeting minutes. Judith stiffened. The whole room went quiet. Then Judith cleared her throat. I can confirm that, she said. The ledger matches our records, and I never signed off on public votes regarding those transactions. Carla finally found her voice. This is out of order. This is manufactured evidence. He's just trying to... Then take me to court, I said, calm, clear. But if you do, everything in that folder becomes public, including the rezoning request pushed through without a full vote, including the financial records, including the signed deed that supersedes your authority. People weren't just listening now, they were watching, recalculating, realizing they weren't powerless after all. A man near the door, Bill something, 2 houses over, spoke up. So wait, the HOA doesn't actually own the lake? I nodded. That's correct. They've been using it without permission. A woman in the front row leaned toward Carla. Then why have we been paying for lakefront maintenance? Carla's lips tightened like a purse string yanked shut. This is all under review. Not anymore, it wasn't. After the meeting, Carla stormed out without speaking. Gavin followed. Phyllis looked like she wanted to crawl inside her clipboard. Judith stayed behind. You just cracked the board open like a walnut, she whispered. She won't recover from this. Good, I said. I'm not finished. The next day, I updated the sign at the lake. Bigger now, clearer. Karma access trespassers will be billed. Community use requires permit. Veterans fish free. Tommy laughed when he saw it. Now you're charging them to use their own illusion. I just smiled. They were never using the lake. They were using fear, and I just repossessed it. The morning after the board meeting, the neighborhood felt different. It wasn't quiet, not exactly, but it wasn't the old silence, the kind people used to keep when Carla walked past their mailbox. It was a charged silence now, curious, watchful. I could feel it even before I stepped outside. Eyes from behind curtains, slow-moving dog walkers, neighbors that suddenly had time to linger by the curb, not out of suspicion, but because the spell had cracked. They were waiting to see what I'd do next. So I gave them something. I walked straight to the bulletin board outside the clubhouse and stapled up 3 copies of the lake access deed, next to the HOA's usual lawn tips and pool hours. Beneath it, I taped a single line. Public record filed with the county. Ignorance is no longer an excuse. That afternoon, I emailed Carla's official HOA address with one clean, brutal document, a cease and desist. It was simple: legal ownership of the lake, unauthorized usage by the HOA, immediate halt to all citations, trespass, or committee rulings that pertain to my property. I CC'd Aaron, I CC'd the county clerk, I even CC'd the HOA lawyer who I figured probably hadn't been looped in on any of this until now. Within 10 minutes, Carla replied. We will be reviewing this matter with legal counsel. Until then, no further communication is necessary. Translation: she was rattled, scrambling, probably yelling at Gavin to print things she didn't understand. Perfect. 2 days later, I got a knock on the door. Not a clipboard knock. A hesitant one. It was Judith. She held a manila envelope and looked like she hadn't slept. I thought you should see this, she said, handing it to me. It's not from the HOA, it's from someone else. It was slid under my door this morning. Inside were 3 typed pages, unsigned, no letterhead, but it was a breakdown of the HOA's emergency strategy plan. They were planning to vote Daniel out of the association entirely. Retroactive enforcement, fine stacking. They were going to paint it as a hostile takeover of community assets by a rogue homeowner. I scanned the text. They're trying to make me look like the villain. Judith nodded. That's always been her play. Control the narrative, and you never have to explain the truth. I placed the pages on the table next to Grandpa's deed. I won't just defend this, I said. I'll expose it. The next move had to be loud, not just legal, but visual, something they couldn't spin, couldn't redact, couldn't edit with HOA-friendly language. So I grabbed the old camcorder Grandpa used to film fishing trips. The battery was long dead, but I had something better now. My phone, a tripod, and a view of the lake. I hit record. Some of you know me as the guy with the old flag. The mailbox, the gnome, the fence, the violations. I've been called a disruption, a nuisance, and apparently now, a threat. I angled the camera toward the water. But here's what I actually am: a homeowner, a veteran's grandson, and the legal owner of the lake this HOA has been using without permission for over a decade. I walked over to the new sign, pointed to it. This lake is not a shared HOA amenity. It's protected land, passed down, documented, and secured. And from this point forward, anyone who uses it without a permit is trespassing. Back to camera, deadpan. If Carla Benwick or the board believes they can scare me into silence, they're welcome to try. But if they want to keep threatening me, they'd better come with a canoe and a good lawyer. I uploaded the video to the neighborhood Facebook group, pinned it, sat back, and watched. Within hours, it had 50 comments, neighbors tagging each other, questions flying, some in support, some confused, some furious that they'd been paying for lake maintenance that the HOA didn't even own. One neighbor posted, "I want my dues back, this is theft." Another wrote, "Daniel, I don't even fish and I'd still pay you before I pay them again." And my favorite, from Tommy, "Helms just turned the HOA into tenants." The tides weren't just turning. They were rising. By the next morning, my inbox looked like a courtroom transcript. Half the neighborhood had something to say, some furious, some grateful, and a few just plain stunned that someone had finally poked the bear and lived to tell the tale. But Carla? She wasn't stunned. She was cornered. And when people like her lose control, they don't retreat. They escalate. The first sign came at 6:43 a.m. when I caught movement on my front security cam. Gavin, Carla's son, dressed in HOA volunteer gear, was walking the property line. He paused at the lake sign, took a photo, then pulled it out of the ground and stuffed it into his trunk. No knock, no courtesy. Just vandalism? Exactly what I was waiting for. I called Erin, still half asleep in her apartment 2 time zones away. Ingo, I said, they took the bait. You've got footage. Clear as day. She exhaled through a laugh. Oh, Daniel, this is going to be fun. By noon, Carla had doubled down. The HOA blasted out an email to the entire community. Unauthorized structures and signage are being removed to maintain harmony and visual consistency. Any further unauthorized actions will be addressed through formal legal proceedings. She was trying to bluff, big words, zero law behind them. But the tone had shifted. Before, she'd ruled through quiet pressure. Now she was using a megaphone, loud, panicked, and public. I printed the email, added it to my evidence folder, then headed to Tommy's place. He was in the backyard, painting a busted garden trellis while an old radio played something twangy. Hey, I called, you feel that? He looked up, grinning. You mean the sound of their queen slipping off the throne? More like choking on the crown, I said. He set the paintbrush down and walked with me toward the lake. There were footprints in the mud where Gavin had been. The sign was gone, but the post still stuck out of the ground like a splinter. I grabbed a new sign from the back of my truck. This one was bigger, and it wasn't just a warning. Lake access is protected under Tennessee Code SS 66. This property is privately owned. Unauthorized removal of signage is punishable by law. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Veterans fish free. Tommy chuckled. You ever consider running for mayor? Not unless mayor comes with a bait shop, I said. An hour later, something unexpected happened. A woman I barely knew, Mira Dalton, lives 4 houses down, retired librarian, showed up with a folder under her arm. I've been reading everything, she said, voice a little shaky. I never liked how Carla ran things, always pushing people around, especially the elderly, but no one had proof. Now you do. She handed me the folder. Inside, a collection of printed emails dated months back between Carla and other board members. One message caught my eye. If we can pressure Daniel with enough citations, we might force a quiet sale. His house is one of the last holdouts from the old agreements. They hadn't just been playing defense. They'd been plotting. This wasn't about my gnome, or the flag, or the fence. It was a long game, and they thought I'd fold. I looked up at Mira, stunned. How did you get these? I've been the HOA's unofficial newsletter editor for years, she said with a tired smile. They forgot who they were copying. That night I hosted a BBQ. Not out of celebration, but as a signal. We grilled catfish and burgers by the lake. No formal invites, just a few chairs, some country music, and a sign that said, Grayson Lakefront, welcome if you knock. Judith showed up, so did Tommy. Mira brought pie, even Bill from the end of the street brought his ancient lawn chairs and sat like a king. People talked, not about fines or rules, but about what this neighborhood used to be before power got in the way. The lake reflected the string lights we hung in the trees, soft, steady, mostly untouched by policy. Control was never Carla's to keep. It was just on loan from the people she underestimated. And now, they were starting to remember that. 2 days after the BBQ, the HOA sent out an emergency notice. Mandatory board review meeting, all members strongly encouraged to attend. That was code for Carla's damage control tour. I showed up 15 minutes early, folder in hand, boots dusted and flag pin clipped to my jacket. The clubhouse was already half full. By the time the clock hit 6, it was standing room only. People weren't whispering this time. They were waiting. Carla entered last, alone. No Gavin, no clipboard entourage, just a tight jaw and that signature, I'm fine even though I'm drowning look. She sat at the center table, cleared her throat, and began with a brittle smile. I know there's been a lot of confusion and misinformation regarding lake access, compliance procedures, and neighborhood policy enforcement. Tonight, I intend to bring clarity to— No, Judith said. The room froze. Carla blinked. Excuse me? Judith stood slowly, pulling out her own folder and laying it flat on the table. I said no. No more spin, no more intimidation, no more pretending. She turned to face the room. For years, I stayed quiet because I thought keeping the peace meant staying neutral. But silence doesn't stop corruption, it protects it. And I won't do that anymore. A murmur spread through the crowd. Judith slid a document across the table. I'm formally resigning from the board, effective immediately, and I'm releasing all financial records, meeting notes, and rezoning communications to the community for open review. Carla's face dropped, but before she could open her mouth, I stepped forward. I'll take it from here. I passed out copies of the folder: deed, ledger, email transcripts, surveyor affidavits, and a printed still image of Gavin removing my sign, time-tagged and geotagged. Here's the truth, I said. This board acted outside its authority. They redrew property lines, redirected funds, and used citations to target homeowners until they gave up or gave in. I held up a copy of the deed. My grandfather helped build this place before the HOA even existed. He left behind something they couldn't erase: ownership, legal, documented, unbreakable. Then I looked at Carla. You tried to take my flag, then my land, then my voice, but I'm still here, and I'm not the only one tired of being quiet. The room erupted, clapping, shouting, neighbors who'd never spoken up before suddenly voicing years of frustration. Carla tried to respond, but it was too late. The narrative was no longer hers to control. A vote was called on the spot, an emergency recall of the sitting board. Hands shot up before the motion even finished being read. Carla sat frozen, lips pressed white, watching her legacy crumble, one raised hand at a time. The vote passed, unanimously. She stood. This is illegal, she snapped. You can't remove an elected board without due process. Tommy called out from the back, beer in hand. Guess you should have read the bylaws you rewrote. Laughter followed, but I didn't laugh. I just turned, walked to the back table, and pinned something to the bulletin board. Notice: all community members welcome to submit applications for interim HO leadership. No prior violations required. After the meeting, people lingered. No one rushed out the door like they usually did. They stood in circles, talking, connecting, making plans. For the first time in years, it wasn't fear keeping them together. It was freedom. Judith walked over, still holding her empty folder. Your grandfather would have been proud, she said. I looked at the flag pin on my chest. He would have told me I took too long. She laughed, maybe, but he also would have been the first one to hang the new sign. Outside, the air was cool, but it didn't bite. The clubhouse lights cast long shadows down the sidewalk, but none of them felt heavy anymore. I paused by the bench across from the lake. The same bench Grandpa built. It was crooked, weathered, still held together by bolts he forged himself. I ran my hand along the top rail, feeling the grooves and chips. Still standing. Just like this community. It took less than a week for the neighborhood to start changing. Not with dramatic speeches or marching protests, but with quieter things, like welcome mats reappearing on porches, lawn chairs dragged back out under the sun, and people waving with something other than tension in their eyes. The HOA board had been gutted. Interim elections were scheduled for the following month. Carla hadn't been seen since the recall vote. Rumor was she'd put her house up for sale within 48 hours. Funny how fast power evaporates when it's borrowed. I spent the next Saturday morning out on the dock. Same bench, same view, but everything felt different. The wind on the lake didn't carry weight anymore. It just moved the surface, light and easy. Birds skipped along the reeds like they had the place back to themselves. In my lap was the last letter my grandfather ever wrote, folded, yellowing at the edges. I found it in that metal cabinet weeks ago and hadn't opened it until now. It was short, just 4 lines. They'll challenge you, not because you're wrong, but because you won't bow. Remember who you are when they try to unmake you. The land is just dirt, the water is just wet. But what you stand for, that's what they can't drain. I read it twice, then slipped it back into the envelope. Later that afternoon, I installed the final sign. It wasn't a warning or a law. It was a tribute. Welcome to Grayson Lake. Established 1972, protected 2025. Veterans, fish free, neighbors welcome. The last part wasn't a loophole, it was a choice. Because power's no good if it just flips the scale the other way. I didn't win to become the next Carla. I won to end the game. People started using the lake differently after that. Respectfully, gratefully. Someone brought their kid down to learn how to skip stones. Another neighbor taught their grandson how to tie a line on an old rod. And me, I just kept showing up. Not to patrol, just to be present, like Grandpa used to. The bench stayed where it was, still crooked, still holding. And one afternoon, I caught Judith sitting there alone, looking out at the water. She had her husband's old fishing hat in her lap. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. I didn't interrupt. Some peace deserves silence. One morning, a letter arrived from the county clerk's office. Inside was the official title amendment, lake parcel legally designated under the Grayson Trust, filed, recorded, and etched into public history. No HOA clause. No loophole. I hung the framed copy in the shed, right next to the cabinet, right below the flag. Legacy didn't need to shout anymore. It just needed to be seen. A month later, at the interim HOA election, I was nominated for board president. I declined. Told them I'd serve on the advisory council if they wanted, but no gavel, no title. I already had what I came for. Respect, stability, in a lake that answered to no one but the truth. The night after the elections, I sat out by the dock again, toes in the water, sun just starting to dip. Tommy wandered over with 2 beers. "You realize they're still mad they have to pay you to fish," he said, smirking. "They're not paying me," I replied. "They're paying to be reminded this place wasn't built by fear." He laughed, raised his bottle, and we toasted the lake like it was a monument. In a way, it was. "You don't win by yelling the loudest," I said aloud, mostly to myself. "You win by still being here when the shouting ends." If you've ever dealt with a controlling HOA or had to fight for something that mattered, drop your story below, or just tell us where you're watching from. Your voice deserves to be heard, and your legacy deserves to stand.